I am really happy that we're all here. Tonight is the first of a triptych of talks. We have Jos Boys here. I'm very happy to be able to welcome her, who is a co-founding member of Matrix, the subject of our exhibition. And we're sitting in this amazing space that has been designed by Lucky. Thank you so much. And there is also this wonderful installation along opposites that is now standing in the hall by Trojan's Collective. So yes, and the exhibition Do Not Carry Your Flag Too Low actions from Matrix Feminist Design Co-operative. I am really delighted that you're here with us, Jos. It's been a while that we have had lectures in person. And Jos, amongst other things, being the founder of Matrix, founding member of Matrix, also teaches at the Bartlett in London, also founded together with Zoe Partington and a group of disabled architects, Disordinary Architecture. And I particularly loved the mission statement, which is to promote activity that develops and captures models of new practices for the built environment led by the creativity and experience of disabled artists. What really struck me is your focus on bodies, both their ability and disability to conform to normative practices or not to conform to normative practices as a way of challenging how we are living, how we are designing, and how we are thinking of space and the built environment. And of course, the notion of the community-based practice and the very strong ethos of Matrix that buildings belong to users and not to architects, that the architects are mere enablers, is something that resonated very much with me, both as an educator and as an architect. So I am really delighted to welcome you here, and quite happily, what coincided with this exhibition is the reissue of this amazing little book, Making Space, Women and the Man-Made Environment, which was authored by Jos and Matrix.
Many others. Yep.
And many other Matrix members. That's available for purchase tonight after the lecture. And yeah, welcome, Jos, to EPFL Architecture and Archizoom.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. It's really great. I feel the same way about actually being here for real. I'm gonna, the talk is Feminism and Architecture Then and Now, and I'm really interested in some of the now. I'll bring some, I've got some examples from the UK about what's happening now, but I'd be really interested in what's happening here. And hopefully if I've organised my talk properly, there will be enough time to have that discussion. This will come up, this image, this is from the Barbican show, which this is a remake of in a really lovely way. And I'll talk about that a little. And I'll also talk a little bit about the Disordinary Architecture project. But mainly what I'm going to start with is just some of that history about Matrix in the 1980s and a little bit into the 90s in the UK in London, and entirely in London at that period.
1 second, I will just share the screen for people on Zoom.
Yes, of course.
Sorry.
So as I said, I'm going to start by talking about sort of London in the 1980s and into the 90s, and kind of try and give you some sense of the conditions in which Matrix operated. Because for me, some of the things about looking at feminist architecture then and now is, where are the gaps? How have they changed? What's still the same? What are the possibilities for maneuver? And the possibilities for maneuver for Matrix, quite a lot of things came together at once, which I think are very different now. I think the conditions are very different. So it's interesting to talk about that too. I wanted to start just because it has one name, Matrix, which of course is deliberate in that you didn't, you know, it's not a star architect. It's not some one famous person who pretends that they've done everything and all the other people in the practice don't count. But it also means that we tend to get treated as if we're one identical entity. People say, oh, Matrix said this in the book, or they said that. And it's like, no, like 10, 12, 15 different women said what they thought. And we're not, it's not a single thing. It was a network. It's called Matrix, before the Matrix. And so this is like a list. This isn't even a complete list. When we started thinking about the archive, we just began to try and remember all the women who'd been involved in very different ways. Some of them directly in the practice, some of them in the book group, some of them through some other connection, like offering expert advice. Many women are missing from this list. This was our first stab at who worked when. So even that information has got a bit lost. So I wanted to just recognise and honour all those women in all their variety. And then, there we go, okay. It's also that thing about, you know, all those women have gone on and done other things. So the fact that we were each involved in Matrix at one particular moment, again, there are kind of ripples forward. There's kind of processes that happen. This is done by Julia Dwyer, just mapping the different tactics from Matrix at the time, but also what women were doing, have done since. And we can come back to that if you want to. But that sense, again, of it being this quite wide-ranging set of practices, perspectives, processes, that it's really important for that to be mentioned. And then I did just want to, again, recognise the work that was done on the Barbican show, which I will come back to, and which is obviously fed into this one, which is called How We Live Now. And some of the women involved in Matrix, if you can see that list, who were interviewed, and some of those videos I think are here. But also all the other people involved in terms of the design of the show itself, various research assistants who did different pieces of work. So again, you can see what I'm saying. You've got me standing up here because I'm the one who's quite good at all that stuff. So I've become the person who gets asked to do these things. And I just want to note that it's not because there's anything particularly special about me. So just to go back to how this all developed in this later phase, rather absent-mindedly, a group of us got together, I guess about 3 or 4 years ago. Some of those women are Matrix women, some of them are not, but it was kind of people who had been involved in some different ways. And mainly it was because we were getting loads and loads of email requests for where people could get at the book, Women in the Man-Made Environment, Making Space, from 1984, because Pluto Press had gone bust and it was selling on eBay for like £350. Sorry, I can't translate that into francs immediately. So there was this kind of idle conversation. We would meet over tea and cake and then nothing would happen. And then out of that group, you can see 7 women on the screen there. And obviously there's somebody taking a photo. 2 of those women are now dead. And that was kind of like, it sharpened our mind a lot. That although we're all relatively young, you know, death hits people, and that it was about time we actually did something. And that became about the book, which fantastically, and Fran Bradshaw, together with some other more recent feminists like Katie Lloyd-Thomas, worked with Verso to have it as part of their feminist classic series, and you'll see it around there. So that's very exciting. It's also discounted, but that actually happened. It didn't happen in time for the Barbican show, but it's kind of extraordinary that we managed to make that happen. And the other thing that came out of it was this idea that those kind of, you know, very small scale architectural practices, or these kind of wider networks, feminist networks, particularly from that period, from the 60s, from the 70s and the 80s, everything's quite ephemeral. The materials get lost. They're stored under the bed, they're stored in attics, they get thrown away, they're just piled up quite randomly because they're not, you know, nothing, although Matrix was very early on in using computers in CAD, the internet there wasn't a way of storing them. So part of what we aimed to do was to say we need to be collecting this stuff. If we don't collect it now, it will get lost, and that seemed something worth doing. But we did it with no money. We did it with no clarity about who was around, who had what, but we did it. And the archive is there. It's still unfinished because we're still trying to get some more funds to do some more work on it. And it's definitely got it's a prototype is what I say. I'm a bit embarrassed by it, but it's there. You can access the materials. And it was always really clear that we wanted it to be open access, that you could just download stuff and use it in your own way, that we had no intention of making this material precious. And also that it would include, it wasn't just plans, that it included as much as we could find. There's quite a lot of just like letters and meeting minutes, handwritten meeting minutes, which are fantastically are in this show, because we wanted to say that all of that is part of what architecture is. It's not just this one moment when these brilliant plans come to be made. So there we are in the, as almost all of us, yes, all of us as architecture students, undergraduate architecture students in the 1970s and 80s, trying to get to grips with what it was about gender that had an impact on the design of built space, on the organization of architecture as a practice, on different kinds of women's everyday lives. And at a time when the word sexism didn't exist, and where generally, if you were studying architecture, it was kind of an assumption that the built environment was neutral, that it didn't affect people differently. So we began to search for any references we could find. There was nothing related to architecture in the UK. There was beginning to be some really interesting feminist architecture in the States. There were some really interesting feminist geographers, both in America and in the UK. And actually, it's just wonderful to see all those books printed out and that you have access to those. Such a lovely thing to do. But this notion of the kind of housewives aesthetic, of the idea that the kind of dream world that women were, that they could wear this couture dress and somehow that their dinner would cook itself, was very, it was already causing all these kind of contestations. It was a really problematic notion. There's a book, which I'm not sure is here, by Betty Friedan, called The Feminist Mystique, which called it The Problem with No Name. So it was an issue particularly for middle-class white women, which is kind of important, this idea that that's what women did. They were the housewife. I mean, there was a woman in the early book group who worked at the British Museum. And when she married somebody else who worked at the British Museum, she had to give up her job. So it's not that long ago that those sorts of things happened. And that was our experience. But at the same time, we were a whole gang of post-war children, the first kind of large number of women going into university education. Again, middle-class white women going into university education. So this wasn't really our dream. There wasn't, and we could see that our own mothers struggled with this kind of idea. And there was a lot of really interesting feminist work from the period. I'll read this out. Sheila Rowbottom, 1973, Women's Consciousness, Man's World. This really, I remember really loving this phrase, that being born female in a world that was designed by and imagined by men, and I'm using men meaning in a generic way, not individual men or individual women, capital M, capital W. It was like lumbering around ungainly like in borrowed concepts which did not fit the shape we feel ourselves to be. And I feel like that was, that really kind of echoed with the experience of many women in that kind of second wave feminism. And of course, Matrix and all its networks was part of a much bigger series of movements, a lot of feminist campaigning. London was completely derelict in the 1970s. Everybody moved out. It was completely wrecked. People didn't live. I know it's hard to imagine, but it's completely true. Whole swathes of London were just falling down, and there were big squatting movements to take over that property and repair it, and there were lots of community action. There were lots of local working class groups that were fighting to save their communities. And that had a lot of connections with Matrix, because many of the women who ended up in Matrix learnt their building skills and then learnt their interest in architecture by being part of squatting collectives, and also like we squatted in Covent Garden because we were part of a movement to try and save it from a plan to drive a huge motorway through the middle. So there was a lot of, this is part of really much bigger movements, again, a kind of a lot of things going on. And there were this magazine Slate. I mean, this was a magazine that wasn't designed by, it wasn't Matrix, but it was part of a whole movement to kind of campaign for different conditions within architecture. It was led by the New Architecture movement. So there was something called the New Architecture movement, which was trying to radicalize architecture, was particularly looking at unions and looking at poor pay conditions for architects. And on the left-hand side, which I will read, or I think, if crime doesn't pay, where do architects get all their money? This was from somebody called Brian Anson, who was a teacher at the Architectural Association and who ran something called the Architects Revolutionary Council. So out of one of the very elite schools, there was a unit that was completely involved in refusing kind of capitalist redevelopment of London. And he was very central in saving Covent Garden from some of the plans for it in the centre of London. So you can see what I'm saying. I'm saying there's a whole set of conditions that were kind of around. It wasn't like Matrix, the women who got involved in Matrix kind of worked it out for themselves. We were part of a lot of other things that were going on. But then when it came to developing Matrix as a design practice, as a book group, as a wider network of women, I think there were a range of things that really, and in a way the show here shows them very well, there were a range of things that became the focus. As I say, different women were involved in different parts. So one was women becoming builders as well, or being involved in connecting with women in the manual trades. So this is Sue Francis, Mary Larscott, who decided not to, who went and lived in the States instead, but they both became trained joiners. They were both trained as architects, and then they became trained as joiners afterwards, because they really wanted to understand those connections, the connections between how buildings get built and how architects design them, and that architects often don't know enough about that. So there's a real disconnection. So there was a real connection to women in the manual trades, to supporting women trying to get into the construction industry, and supporting with training, which is very well shown in this exhibition. On the bottom, on the far side, is a model of Jagannarii Asian Women's Centre, which was built and is in the show. And yes, that way, thank you. And it's not an accurate model. All the models that we used, obviously, in the 1980s have fallen apart, disappeared, do not exist, and not necessarily, there's one or two photographs of them, but really that's all. But the models were used as, it's really simple. There was a whole set of ways of explaining the core skills of architecture very, very simply. And I'll talk about that in a bit. Then there's the book group, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And obviously, that's one picture of some of the women in Matrix at one stage, and a changing roll call of some really brilliant women who were part of it. So I wanted to talk a little bit around the kind of book side. This is Anne Thorne again with her younger son. One of the things we want, so there was a whole set of things that kind of, we didn't really know what they were that we needed to be looking at, but it was, obviously, there were differences in how the built environment was designed and how it affected you differently by gender, but by other factors like race, sexuality, whether you had children, whether you were old, that there were a set of things that we needed to work out how space came to be gendered. Sounds like a stupid thing, but it was like completely, we just didn't know how to talk about that. So that's really what the book was about. It was us trying to work that out. And I mentioned before, one of the things that we did was we looked at who was already writing about that in the 1970s and into the 80s. When we also looked at what was going around, what was the kind of milieu in which we were operating, what was being taught to architects and what was being used in the profession. And I don't know if you can see these. These are from a couple of housing manuals from the 1970s. This one, I really love this one, actually. The second one is, there's two going through the day. So this is what housing designers were given as the model for how you designed functionally a house. And so you can see at the top, people are getting dressed and all that, but at a certain point, well, what you notice is this is the woman. She hasn't really moved from the sink. She's at the sink the whole time. She's at the sink and she's shopping, and she's at the sink and she's feeding, and she's at the sink and she's hoovering. And everybody else goes out, and she does go out, but everybody else goes out. And in fact, the second one it's very much the same, going right down to, you know, when they all go to bed. But she's still there, and the husband comes in, and then there's a lovely little picture of him watching the television. So he comes in and then he's watching. So there's a kind of really stereotyped idea of what it is, but how the gender separation was, what it should be like, what you should be doing, who was doing what, which is already not true. Households were really changing. That wasn't the norm anymore, but it was what architects were taught, architectural students and professionals were taught as the way to design houses. So you could begin to unpick that. You could begin to unpick what was happening. And the other one is from, I always forget what it's called, although it's from the article that I wrote in the book. It says at the bottom, so you can see this hidden corner. And there's a little picture of what it would look like in plan. And then it says to us, come in, this might lead somewhere. There may be an exit. And like when I read that, and I think it's probably true for lots of men in the room, but when I read that as a woman, it's like, when I see that, I'm not like, oh, let's go and have a look. Won't this be exciting? It'll be perfectly safe. I might find the way out. I mean, it's just madness, but that standard guidance, absolutely standard guidance. And you can see housing schemes, public housing schemes across the UK built on that basis. So these are the kind of assumptions that got made, which either assume something about gender differences or it ignored gender differences. So you could begin to unpick what these things were. And I think that's where the kind of publication side started, really, in trying to unpick that. You've seen the updated version of the book. I just wanted to show you this one. 1984, it was published. I really love this one because this is the copy that somebody stole for me from the Bartlett School of Architecture in about 2 years ago. And inside it had, it's very old fashioned now, but it had all those paper, you used to, maybe none of you ever did the paper stamping thing, maybe you still do it here. It had like hundreds of sheets stamped. It had been very well read. It had people underlining things. It had pages torn out. It had little stickers all over it. And it showed this enormous, that there was a real need to read it. But at the same time, like the Bartlett had never bought another copy. Just like they only ever had this one. And of course, when we stole it, they didn't have it anymore. But so it kind of, for me, it captured something about an unmet demand to think about these things. If I'm talking about other things related to the practice, and again, it's so well explained in the exhibition here, so some of these things are just repeating, really. The idea, the publication was about trying to share what we were finding out in lots of different ways, very different perspectives. But it was also about this needed to be a public debate, needed to involve lots of people. And so there were always events. There was an idea that part of the job of the Matrix network was to organise different kinds of events, and had the opportunity to talk these things through. Again, some of these are here, and there were lots of different aspects, really, of what needed to be thought about in relationship to architectural education. And as I said, related to women in the manual trades too, that there was an idea that there were lots of different sorts of skilling up that you could do. It wasn't just about being an architect. Architecture was, some of you will have heard me say this, a very white middle-class profession. And if you just concentrated on architecture, you were missing out all the range of ways in which women could work across the building industry. And Women in the Manual Trades in the UK still exists. Fantastic organisation. It's still pushing for, it's changed, it's become very much of the contemporary period, and it used to be this very radical community group, and now it's part of a non-profit company called Procure Plus. But still, fantastic, just still pushing for more women builders. And the kind of part of this is, of course, just making it more normal for there to be more women involved everywhere. And that it's kind of odd that the way the gender imbalances still happen, where they've changed and where they haven't. And again, very well shown in the show here, but this is Andergrass Johnson, one of the architects from Matrix. But so a job designing buildings was about just anybody interested in architecture and building. It wasn't about how to be an architect. It was about how to be a surveyor or a planner or a builder. It was what those jobs involved. Again, it was all about just explaining these things simply and not trying to make them esoteric. And then on the other side is from Women into Architecture and Building, which was an access course. That is for people who didn't have formal academic qualifications, but a way of going on into university, which was founded by Yvonne Dean at the University of the Polytechnic of North London, and went on for many years. Actually still exists, but in a very different form, which was again taking this idea that everybody could learn architecture. You just needed to have really clear ways of explaining it and not assuming that it was like special and that you had these special talents, that it was actually, you could explain to people what plans and sections and elevations were really easily. And only now have I really got to the design practice, because although people think about Matrix as the Feminist Design Co-operative, it had many variations before it became an actual formal practice, which was partly just to do with getting the jobs in, but it was also to do with having having an office. It was about having a financial model that worked. And so this was really, I think this was probably the first proper Matrix leaflet under the proper name. And I think, again, you'll see others in the show. Matrix was very good at promotion. It's not, sometimes one assumes, I think, that these kinds of groups are just busy doing very good work, but there's like huge numbers of different promotional material that was produced in different periods, because it's vital. If you're providing architectural services, people need to know you. And I said I'd talk a little bit about all the different design techniques. So some of these are so simple and obvious. So, but it feels to me like architecture's actually gone the other way. Certainly where I work at UCL at the Bartlett, doing those absolutely gorgeous, really complex axos that have millions of things going on, are very much the rage. And I think it was definitely the opposite view, which is what kinds of tools could you have that enabled the people who were going to get the building to actually participate in and co-design that building. So a lot of that was about just really explaining what scale and what a plan is and what sort of choices you can make. This is from Dalston's Children's Centre, which was in a old swimming baths. And so part of this was about just literally being able to move things around. Again, I mean, it does happen, and there's lots of public participation like this, but it was very much doing it in a way that could empower women to feel confident in making choices. It's been mentioned before, but one of the things that was done a lot was the meeting room you met in regularly, you did various scale versions of that, so that when you were trying to imagine the actual size of the space you were getting, you had a space to connect it to. There were lots of work that was done with ribbons, which was about measurement and scale, how you measured something and then how you understood it at different sizes. So just very straightforward techniques. And a lot of that was building a real relationship with the user group. There was a moment when there was enough money to do that properly. This is Jagannaри, this is from the film Paradise Circus, which was made for a BBC TV channel in 1989. And I show it just because it's Anne Thorne, who was a job architect on that. And I always remember Sufi Alman. And it's just a beautiful little clip in the film, because she says very calmly, well, we really wanted to work with women architects, and we wanted to work with a reputable company, a very reputable company. And Anne goes like this. She grins from ear to ear and has to kind of hide her the idea that Matrix was reputable, I think, was still something we hadn't quite got our head around. And again, pictures here. This is an example. This was called a brick picnic. There was a lot of discussion about, this was a brick building and a brick facade, really, and a whole terrace in East London. So what the front was like was very important. And so they went, the women took their children and went to look at lots of different buildings and just argued over the colours of the bricks and the mortar. And this is the resulting building. The people on the tour will have heard this from me already. The screens are very practical. This was a time when Asian families were being firebombed a lot. There was a very racist National Front movement in London at the period. So they're not just there for decoration, but it's also true that there was a lot of discussion about them not having particular Asian religious symbolism, so that they weren't putting off particular women who might be involved. And interestingly, Anne Thorne, I will say this because you are an architectural group, Anne Thorne's dad was an architect, and he worked in a long arts and crafts tradition. He'd worked for people who'd worked for Philip Webb and William Morris. He had a direct connection to all those people. He had their archive. And I always think that actually this is an arts and crafts building. Like, people often say, what's a feminist architecture look like? And we're like, we don't really care. And we don't think that's an interesting question. So for me, what's interesting about this is it's a completely feminist building because of what the operations and services it enables, and very detailed thinking about what it contains. But actually it's an arts and crafts building. So I think that's nice. And then again, another building, this is from a later generation. So this is from Anne de Graaf Johnson and Mo Hildebrand and Gozi Wamo. And this is, again, the model. So this is, we only have this really dirty slide of the model. I don't know quite why nobody's cleaned it, but so that's a very good example of the kind of models that have been used at those stages. This is for a women's refuge in, so women escaping from domestic violence in Essex. That's all I can tell you. I can't tell you more precisely because you have to keep these places secure because there's a lot of violence. And in this case, this was the building they'd been given by a conventional architect. And they so disliked it that they asked Matrix to, because it was very institutional, they asked Matrix to come and adapt it. And one of the things that happened out of that is, for example, like these kind of kitchen, so only 2 or 3 women had shared the same kitchen. So it wasn't like you were all in this big kind of institutional cooking place. And it had lots of other really lovely details, but it's very when Anne de Graaf Johnson talks about this, I think what she feels is a sorrow that the kind of funding that had been around from the Greater London Council for something like Jaganari, because of political changes in the UK around conservatism and Margaret Thatcher, that money was no longer available, and they had to start working with the client, the proper client, and not with the users, and some things were cut from the scheme that all these years later Anne is still very cross about. So those are just some examples of the kind of range of things that happened, which I'm really repeating what the exhibition does very well. So I wanted to talk a bit about, bless you, the show that we did at the Barbican. And so the interesting thing for me about that is about a week after I'd got some money to do, a very small amount of money, to begin the archive, to begin collecting the archive and to do some interviewing of some of the women who were still around. The architecture curator at the Barbican Centre in London, John Asbury, sent me an email and said, we'd like to do a show about Matrix. And I'm like, fine, we don't have any stuff. Does that matter? And so we did the show without knowing what was going to go in it. And we built up those things sort of parallel to the show being designed. So Edit Collective, who designed this one, and it's lovely to see the Clique and Edit Collective and the different ways they did it. It was a very different way of doing an exhibition. And part of that was connected to this idea that this is material that should be shared, could be used in different ways, was open access, didn't need to be an original, you know, what does it really need to be an authentic item? All those sorts of discussions are ones that we were having. And what I really loved about this show and the way that it was designed by Edit is it had it was done around the idea that you could just hang out there, that you could just, you could choose to look at the work, you could choose, there was a big table in the middle, you could just go there and have the first person I took a photograph of was in fact this woman with the baby on her front, and she fell asleep about 10 minutes after I took this photograph. And I'm like, great, she's found somewhere to have a sit down. And so there were a set of different zones, but with this idea that it had a slightly domestic feel, but not and also a kind of unbuilt feel. I'll just show you some pictures from, so you can just see the differences. And the other thing that happened, and I don't know if that's something that, because you've got a really lovely catalogue, but because this was, and the other thing about all this is it was happening during the pandemic. So we were trying to collect this material without being able to go near people and collect it from their houses. So people were taking rather terrible photographs. I was having Zoom calls with people where they were kind of showing me stuff. It's pink. Yes, but what does it say? I don't know. Hold on. This is the sons of Sue Francis, who had died by then. They're really lovely, but they were like, oh, what's this? So part of that, and this is very much John Asbury's idea, part of that was this idea that you could have, instead of having a catalogue, you could have a kind of at-home pack. But there were going to be people who wouldn't be able to come to the show. And so you could have something which wasn't the show and wasn't a copy, it wasn't a catalogue of the show, but was a set of different things to do or read or play with. And I think it's absolutely beautiful. It didn't occur to me to bring one. The Barbican is a private art gallery and theatre and all that. And they wouldn't let us print very many copies because they didn't want to lose any money. And so we've run out, but hopefully we might be able to print some more. But it's just, there's something again about the pandemic, about this open access thing, about learning from how you might organize things in a very different way when you come to archives around architecture, and particularly non-normative architecture. So I have no idea about how am I doing for time. Oh, it's okay. It's all right, isn't it? Yeah. A little bit longer. I mentioned at the beginning that one of the things that I think is quite important is not just to kind of that all the people, all the different women in Matrix had, you know, that have, there's just a whole range of lives and a whole different ways of operating. Some women got out of feminism completely. Some people went and lived in the country and don't talk to anybody ever again because they were quite badly burnt out by feminism, second wave feminism. And some women have done other things. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about what I've been doing, but then I would like to talk just briefly about some of the other women involved and only a really tiny cross-section. So I wanted to just make links between the Disordinary Architecture project and the feminist work. So, and it's really great that this is read out, but I'm going to read it again. We had a really fantastic co-design workshop where we developed this mission statement to promote activity that develops and captures models of new practice for the built environment, led by the creativity and experiences of disabled artists. So the point of the Disordinary Architecture project, really, which is I co-founded with Zoe Partington, who is herself a disabled artist, is that disability is still put in a completely different bracket. You know, even feminists, all you feminists in the room, actually still treat disabilities if it's kind of a functional leftover, and it's just like all you need is the access requirements and you've done your job. But the kind of politics around disability and the disability activism, which has been as powerful as other civil rights activisms, just gets forgotten. It's got turned into building regulations that people had no idea of the history of how they came to be like that, or the fact that they're not functionally accurate, that they're really contested documents. They just become something that you use. And the other thing about it is, at least with feminism and with Matrix, there were women in architecture, not as many as there are now, but there were women in architecture. There are lots of disabled people in architecture. I know because I co-run a project about disability in architecture. And people will tell me, because we create safe spaces for that, but it's not something you admit to, because unless it's really obviously a visible disability, in which case you're really going to struggle to be allowed into architecture school. Particularly, I have to say, somewhere like Switzerland, which has a really bad rep, I'm afraid, among all my disabled friends. And I'll just put that out there, and you can tell me it's wrong, so you keep it hidden. So if we're talking about really thinking very differently about disability as like something that's just much more creative and about the whole range of bio and neurodiversity and how that's something really exciting and valuable to the design of the built environment, it's something that should be valued and not just sort of shunted off to the side and left till the end. It's only now that we're beginning to build networks of deaf disabled architects who are committing to doing, to that being part of what they're willing to campaign about, because it just destroys your architectural career, and students too. So that's what we do, and we do a lot of work into architecture schools. We do a lot of kind of CPD with practices. We're just doing quite a big festival design project in Braunschweig near Hanover. We do quite a lot of different things, and there's probably like 25 disabled artists, very different disabled artists who are involved regularly, and probably another 10 or 20 that are involved on some projects. The disability arts in the UK is really vibrant, so there's lots of really brilliant artists out there. We're not talking art therapy, we're talking people who make really good quality work. And the thing that I wanted to do about connecting it, and this probably doesn't cover this in enough detail and we can come back to it, but one of the things in feminist disability politics, which I'm sure none of you have done, well, this is very rude of me, there's fantastic work out there in disability activism and scholarship and artwork, creative practice, but it doesn't penetrate architecture schools. And that's been one of my jobs, just as with Matrix, is to publish stuff that says, it's here, if you want to use it, it's here, and it's very architectural. It's this notion of the misfit. So rather than this idea that you have the normative person who's not even called that, the able-bodied person, who's just there, and then you have these disabled people. We're like, poor disabled people. We must do something for them over here. What we actually have is something that's much more relational. You can fit in your built environment. or you can misfit. And that's not just about disability. It can be about gender, it can be about sexuality, it can be about race, and it can be different in different situations, how much you do or don't fit. And if you misfit, then that's often really frustrating and difficult, but it's also potentially a site of creativity. So we tend to say people who are pretty normative, who fit in the world really smoothly, the world is made around them, and I'm sorry, all you young white men, but let's just admit to it. If then that smoothness means there's lots of things you don't notice. You don't have to notice them. The world doesn't come up to bite you. You can run about the place and it will just work for you. You can hop on your bicycle and shoot off somewhere else and you'll be fine. Whereas there are a lot of people who misfit in different circumstances. And this from Rosemary Garland Thompson. A misfit occurs when world fails flesh in the environment one encounters. And for me, that connects in lots of ways to that earlier Sheila Rowbottom quote about lumbering around in concepts that don't seem to match who you are. So that's the kind of underpinning of the way Disordinary works. It works on this basis that we fit and misfit in different ways. And just as with Matrix, it's about modes of practice. It's not just about being better and making the world work better for disabled people, although that's important too. But it's actually about completely rethinking the way that we design, our design methods, the concepts that we use, the terminology that we use, and taking notice of all the sorts of things that could really offer some new creative routes. The project in Braunschweig is around the notion of deaf space, designed by deaf architects. There's an idea that if you sign, deafness is a very social and performative activity, and that actually there's a connectivity there which is really powerful as a way of thinking about built space. Again, I'll talk about that if you want me to, but this is a project we did in Copenhagen at the Royal Academy of Design. I won't talk about it now. This is Naomi Lackmeyer, who works with us quite a lot and does some really surreal and fantastic work, but also does a lot of theoretical work. So if you do a project with her, you end up talking about Heidegger quite a lot. And part of what we do is it's extending that notion of who does or doesn't fit. So for me, I love this picture because it's like the built environment tends not to provide places to rest easily. And often if you have a chronic illness and you need to rest, people will tell you off for lying down. So here's somebody who's just reused a bicycle rack, something designed for another group of people to find at least some moment of repose. And this is a project that connects to that, which an artist I work with called Raquel Meziguy does. So this is just, again, in Copenhagen, just exploring the idea about how you could make places to lie down. A little bit more about disability, same thing, just as what we did with Matrix, lots of fantastic reading out there. This project, this is Maya Mingus from New York, the Disability Visibility Project. They have a great campaign called Access is Love. Anybody ever called Access Love in architecture school to you? Maybe it's a really nice thought to think about, and a collective, emergent way of thinking about built space and other forms of collective care. Disability justice, the idea that we need social and spatial and material justice, that we're not just, access and inclusion is a very mealy-mouthed way of saying that. It's like, oh, let's just have access and inclusion. Much more political. And underpinning it, and again, underpinning, I think, everything that I've said, is this thing about recognizing difference, being critical of where that difference is treated as a problem, as something to marginalize particular groups over or discriminate, and thinking about how you might celebrate them. It is not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate these differences. And I would connect that through to Matrix, even if politically we were operating in a slightly different milieu. So I'm coming to a conclusion. I'm I'm quite interested in this thing about what has changed and what hasn't changed and what's different here to, say, the UK at all sorts of levels. I don't just mean gender. This is a wonderful cartoon by Janice Goodman from the 1980s, which was about a kind of idea about, yes, women can be architects, but they can't, they can only do a certain amount. This is by a very famous British cartoonist called Louis Hellman, which is about professional practice and how it perpetuates certain sorts of ways of being over others. These may be some people, you know, the top two are actually work by Anne Thorne, who I've mentioned several times, who was one of the founders of Matrix, and she and Fran Bradshaw, who was involved in Matrix, have actually ever since then run women-only practice, Anne Thorne Architects. And this was an early work in Aldgate Tube Station. This is just finished. This is a cooperative housing project in Colchester. So there's a kind of set of things that have gone on, you know, like, you know, Anne Thorne's life is actually about that, about the amazing projects that they've done as Anne Thorne Architects. But she will always be branded one of the co-founders of Matrix. So all that later work, very feminist work, is kind of just somehow doesn't get remembered. And then I think, just so randomly, just picking some really brilliant, you may well know Maquette in Sweden, a lesbian collective, architectural collective. There's a lot of really interesting work going on in the UK around Black women, particularly getting together to kind of rethink the way that second wave feminism was often very white and very middle class. There's an amazing movement around, just like the new architecture movement, called SAW, the Section of Architectural Workers. So there's a really big groundswell in the UK around the very problematic practices in architecture, that you work very long hours, you're often very underpaid, that there's a kind of notion that the ideal type of person to be as an architectural student, as an architect, is obsessional, unencumbered, no other life, whatever that, you know, no other life, no other passion, nothing else but this working. If you don't work all hours, night and day, and produce enormous amounts of work, then somehow you're failing. It's a kind of completely artificial model. It doesn't need to be like that. And I think that these movements, which NAM was about very much, about and fighting for, campaigning for better conditions for architectural workers. And again, you notice it's called architectural workers. It's not called architects, because just like Matrix, it has that same very broad remit. I just picked these completely at random. This is Sound Advice, which is a Black architects collective, but that uses the idea of sound and music as a kind of way of rethinking getting into architecture and treat it differently, and is very firm. It's not, doesn't tiptoe around racism. It's really interesting. And although this isn't a very good picture, I really love their work. I wanted to mention Edit Collective again. And I was just talking to Lekik about it. They, like many people these days, they all work for mainstream architects. And then on the side, they do this fantastic feminist. It's really worth seeing the work they're doing. They produce a lot of really interesting feminist work. But for me, that's part of the shift. We, in the 1970s and 80s, we could all live incredibly cheaply. We were squatting. We were living in a derelict city that didn't really, you couldn't spend money on much. And we could manage, especially if we had some sort of middle-class background, we could manage very easily to find space to work, to organize these other things. I feel like the world has changed, that all of that is much, much tougher. And that the kind of way that Edit work now, where they're trying to sneak it in, their more radical practice in around having to earn a living, is perhaps, it's just being honest about what the situation is, that kind of this challenge, these challenges to architectural practice that's probably where well, it's not probably where they're happening. It is happening to a huge extent, but it's really tough. It's very tough. And one last plug for the archive. The way that we did it, I'm not sure it's right, but you know, you have to make these decisions. We decided that the archive itself would be, and if you've looked at it, it's very old-fashioned looking, because we decided we wouldn't use any fancy widgets. The designer is the same age as me, and he and I we're just a bit stuck in our ways. So it's quite old-fashioned. And we know that there's a certain point about when nothing else is going to be added, because I'm doing it on a volunteer basis, and so is he. So at a certain point, it will just have to stop, the archive side of it. It's an amateur job. There's nothing, there's nowhere, it's completely precarious. So the idea is that we have these kind of blogging elements which will grow, or will grow if people get involved in them. And I'm really happy if anybody wants to, you know, add some things, take over this for a bit, find some things, maybe build it into some teaching that happens here. There's a category which is called Explore, which is about taking things from the archive and connecting them to other things. And there's a category called Collaborate, which is about the fact that is about what networks are being built and about how many networks there are, and finding out about those networks very easily. So the idea is that those keep developing, but they only keep developing if other people get involved, because I'm just going to run out of steam soon on that. So that's where I'm ending. I've put some links in, which I don't know quite, it'll be on the recording, to some things which are about this overlap between the Matrix stuff and the disorderly architecture stuff, and something about kind of thinking about feminist design practices now. So they're things that, if you're interested, they expand some of the things that I've talked about. So thank you.
Jos, thank you so much for taking us through that. It's really reassuring to have this aspect of compassion and empathy and kindness that runs through the work, and I think it's a really strong reminder to all of us, students, teachers, professors, people, to be a certain way, to have a certain openness. So thank you so much. I would love to open the floor. Questions, if anyone has something to address.
It's fine. It's always hard.
It's Jose. So I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that you had a co-design workshop. I guess it's something that you did many times in your practice before. So I'm kind of interested in that. And my question would be if there is any tool that you think is most important, or even as a starting practice, 6 co-design. I don't know, some guidance or some idea or yeah.
Thank you. That's a really good question. And I think, I mean, there's quite a lot of variations on co-design, so I can only talk about what I have done and we have done in different ways. And I think with the Disorderly Architecture project, which I'll talk about first, is very clear on 2 things. One is everything is co-design or co-development, and the disabled people involved always get paid, even if the non-disabled people don't, because disabled people are often assumed that they'll be volunteers. And the co-design process there is really it's very straightforward. So for example, if we're working into architecture schools, which we do a lot, then an artist and a tutor will work together designing a project. And that might be several artists with several tutors, or it might be, there's lots of different ways of doing it. And what we really like is a long-term relationship and engagement. And what we really like is where the disabled artists become actual tutors, but you'll be surprised, well, you won't be surprised how hard that is to enable. And that includes being involved in assessment. And a lot of it is about the difference between art practice and architectural practice in that case. So I think sometimes bringing those things in from outside of architecture, it's not just about bringing in the notion of disability in a very creative and diverse way, but as soon as you start talking about art practice and architectural practice, it's not that architecture, you know, that one is better than the other, but you have to stop and think about what are the norms of architectural practice and what are the norms of art practice. And a lot of our work actually ends up being about that. So the co-design is always that people get paired up. And we try as often as possible to have like 50% of disabled people in the room, which is often really hard to do. But that's the aim, is to not have an imbalance, because it's so often the case, and it's true of community organizations too, like you have the one community organizer representative, or you have the one person of color who's somehow meant to express the opinions of every single person of color. Do you know what I mean? So it's breaking out of those normative ways of working. And so that, so we like it to be a long-term relationship, but that's often quite hard to build. So across a whole year or across several years, we have artists in residence, we have had, but we have the other version, which we call a hit squad, where you just go in with a lot of artists all together of an afternoon, because it, in many ways, and I'm talking particularly here about, well, not just education, actually practice too, the flexibility that people have. They might want to do those sorts of things, but they don't have flexibility. They don't have the flexibility to design a project which has this kind of width of engagement in it. But it's just that very simple pairing. And when we work with architectural practices, we do a similar thing, and we have protocols, because architects are taught to be quite good at persuading other people, which means they're quite good at not listening to other people, which means that when you put an architect and an artist together, if you haven't got protocols about how that relationship works, even though they may not know that they're doing it, the architect may well take over. So we have protocols and we have training. We train artists in how to cope with working with architects. Yep.
Are those protocols accessible?
Yeah, they are. I mean, are they accessible? I thought you meant, of course they're accessible. They're about disability. No, sorry. You mean, can you see them? I think you should be able to see them. I think Disordinary has been going since 2008, but it's been a very informal platform and it's had lots of gaps. And it's very deliberately a very slow building of what works and what doesn't work. It's like learning lessons, because it's weirdly very new. It's weirdly something that doesn't get thought about. So the protocols are we've played around with different protocols, and what we don't have is like, this is the way to do it. But I think we should. I think that is something where you can have a really clear set of protocols. There are some other disability like Disability Visibility Project, and well, there's several. I have to think of them. But I think, so the answer to that is no, not yet. But I think it's something we should definitely have. I think it's useful to share something like that. Again, the people who came on the tour heard me talk about money a lot, money and knowledge and power. And Disordinary architecture also works on a shoestring. And it's like finding a way to make that happen, that we can actually spend the time to make sure that not only is it done, co-design takes time. And so designing those, being clear about what the protocols are that we use and agreeing them with everybody is something that just takes time, that we haven't had. But it's a really good question. With Matrix, it was more, I don't know if we would have called it co-design. I think co-design is a relatively new notion, and I think it was it was a radical version of public participation where you just thought all the time about what were the what it is you learn, and I'm going to go on about this about being rude about architects, but what it is you learn that stops you being able to communicate and stops you being able to listen. So it's the same thing, really. And it's like, how do you unwind that? How do you go back from that and really have ways of taking notice properly and have ways of sharing, in community architecture in the 1980s, I think there was a real sense that you could just be a neutral conduit, like your community users just told you things and you just turned it into a design, just like without being in any way involved, you know, you just did what they said. And of course, that's rubbish. That's not how design works. You have skills and you bring knowledge to it. So it was about trying to think what that was and how you could be really explicit about those things. And I don't know how, well, I think Annie, you know, and it's like Annie Thorne and Sue Francis were really good at that. And actually, Annie, you know, the women involved in the design practice were really good at that. But again, it wasn't formally written down. It was like, it was out of their own ability to do that kind of, you know, to do what it said on the tin, to do it properly. So thank you, really. I should have talked about that more. That's really good. We'll do the protocol soon. The other thing we really want to do, just because I can go on, you know, you can hear, I can talk for hours. One thing we're trying to get money for that we've wanted to do for ages is, the thing is, if you are in the field of architecture and the built environment, the stuff that you get around disability is incredibly banal. It's that design guidance with all those little drawings, templates that you can kind of just drop into your, and you don't know whether they're right or wrong. You've got no idea really, and you don't have the time. So you have this incredibly banal way of looking at disability as a kind of technical functional problem, and you're taught to design buildings for normal people, and then you add these things at the end for all the people you've already excluded. It's kind of weird that we do that, and there's all sorts of historical reasons why we do, but we really want to, out of the work that we've been doing, we really want to do a kind of compendium, like something that's very, like got comic strips in it and lots of different iconography and lots of different things that artists and other people are doing, which is just like a flip book. It's like you're in practice or you're a student and you know that you ought to be thinking about this and you can flick through it. And it isn't just about the standard, you know, what a wheelchair user needs, or it's not by category. So it's kind of, you know, people are inventing signs for, you know, here's a place for people with chronic illness to sit down. You know, there's a whole iconography going on of different, you know, if you're going to use those little symbols, could we make them just a huge range of them instead of the wheelchair one? Anyway, so that's I don't know why I'm telling you that. If anybody's got, you know, money in the family, I would like to donate, because that can be co-designed brilliantly. We've got, you know, 25 artists and we've got 25 architects and loads of students, and we could just do it in a series of workshops. It would be fabulous. Turn it into a design project. I'm sorry to look at you like that. So yeah, there's lots of gaps.
For the matrix, was it ever a question to include men? It was shown from the beginning that you would only be working with women.
Yeah, I mean, some of that is to do with the period and how things have changed, because I think the whole kind of feminist consciousness raising that was part of second wave feminism, there was a real feeling that it needed to be done separately. And some of it was also about our lived experience, which was, you know, Matrix, the group that became Matrix, which was called, well, actually, there's lots of disagreements about what it was called, Feminist Design Group. Anyway, whatever it was called, it was women who'd had something to do with the new architecture movement and had just got really fed up that nobody listened to the women and that the women always had to make the tea. You know, it was just really stereotyped, and it was very hard to break out of that. I think that has changed. I think it's changed in a variety of different ways, but I think it has some good, some bad, but I think it has changed. I think that there were many less feminist men around. There were feminist men, but it was just, it was like trying to take time out to work it out as a group of women. And then that in itself was problematic because it did, well, as you may know, second wave feminism in the UK anyway, imploded because of kind of lesbian separatism, and where it's like, if you're heterosexual, you're letting the side down, and really important complaints from women of color about how it was very exclusionary. So it wasn't even like all women together was working very well. But no, there was never, it felt like it really needed to be a group of women.
Just have one question, because you mentioned inclusion a lot, and this is obviously a really kind of key topic of Matrix as well. And you are now in learning environments, equality, diversity, and inclusion. And I think I really love, for example, in your unruly bodies, that you really talk about bodies, and I think in an interview you were doing with Zoe Parkinson, you had laden somebody who was able-bodied with really heavy shopping and sent them. And I love this idea that this is how we understand how we move. But at the same time, we see this kind of shifting, or certainly in Switzerland, we see the shifting trend of, propelling the stereotype of I have to define myself as so-and-so and this so-and-so and this so-and-so. And I just wondered how you saw that, because it, on the one hand, of course, it raises the issues which need to be raised. But on the other, it also has this kind of, that you have to be stereotyped in a way, that you have to fit into a category, and if you don't fit, then further, there's further not invention, but definitions of further stereotyping. And I just wondered how you see that balance, let's say.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I guess, I think just talking initially from my perspective, although the title has the word inclusion in it, that's to play the political game, as you've heard me say. I would much rather it said social, spatial and material justice, but I'm not going to get away with that in my current working life. I think that what I love about the fitting, misfitting, is that it doesn't, I'm actually really against identity politics. I'm really against the way that identity politics is being used by the right to do a kind of fake cancel culture thing. So I'm not against it in that way. But I think that it's this thing about it always being relational, which we kind of know. And there are a lot of really good theorists about that, like Sarah Artwood. There are a lot of theorists who are looking at this notion that our embodied experience, and you're right, I should talk about bodies much more, because a lot of our work is very embodied. We have a notion of embodied practice. What does it mean to do embodied architectural practice? What does it shift? What does it change, if you think about that? But embodied experience is, it depends on the situation. It's contextual as well, it's situational. So you always have to look at particular sets of circumstances, and you have to analyze who's fitting and who's misfitting. And that's very mixed. It's not always that somehow, if you're a person of color, you're going to be discriminated against, or if you're trans, you're going to be discriminated. But it's mixed, and it's got to be, so we have to have much more sophisticated ways of understanding those kind of, that way of thinking about the world, I think. And I do, so we use misfitting and fitting exactly because of that reason. And the example you talk about embodied experience, so we never ever do, there's an idea, and I don't know if it happens here, but there's an idea that if you're talking about, you might have one special needs project, one disability focused project in your entire architectural training, and then it's all about those poor disabled people. So it's kind of this separate thing. And by talking about fitting and misfitting, you don't get caught up in that. You're looking at what these interrelationships are and who benefits and who doesn't. And I think for me, that's a way forward. And the example there's a lot of interest in this kind of, simulation, like you get put in a wheelchair as an able-bodied person and you blindfold yourself, and then you'll kind of experience what it's like. And of course you don't. What you experience is the fear and panic that you're suddenly not the person that you were. You don't get the experience of learning and being part of and just growing up with a different kind of body or a different kind of mind, and you don't value or celebrate it. So the one you mentioned, which is called Characterism, which is one of Zoe Partington's projects, is the idea that if you're trying to think about embodied uses of space, then if you just change the way you use your body, particularly as an able-bodied, as a normative or non-disabled person, creative person, then you start noticing both the things that are really interesting about that and the things that are problematic. So one of them, there's quite a lot of, they're all deliberately silly, but and they're all designed by Zoe, who is wonderfully silly. The idea is that you pick up as many things as you can carry, and then you have to do a set of tasks. And, in a room like this, you set that as one of your tasks, and people will pick up an enormous amount of things because it's like, oh, I can carry all of this. So people load themselves up with stuff. And then you say, right, now you've got to walk down the corridor, down the stairs, out the door, back around the corner, and up the front. And the first thing is that people can't open the door. Except if they're very clever with their elbow. And then that's really interesting because your whole body changes and you're quite proud of yourself for being able to open the door with the elbow, but you also realise that you've had to think really hard about opening the door. And then you go down the stairs and you're like, oh my God, I'm going to fall over. And so you begin to experience a whole range of things about disabled, the experience of having a different sort of body or body mind that's both rather creative, but also has to be negotiated. And that's, we always say disabled people are the creative experts in the built environment because they're the ones that have to negotiate all its problems. So they know a lot more about the built environment and how it works than anybody who can just zip around it without thinking. So that was a rather rambly, but I think, so I love that Characters one because it is saying it's not about identity. It's about experiencing your body and your body mind in a particular situation and learning from it. Sorry, not very good answer. But...
Wonderful. So I think we will call that a wrap. Thank you so much, Jos. I think we have a small arrow in that direction, and the book is in that direction.
Yes.
There is it's true that there is the book making space, and that Jos, you agreed to, there is some pencil, you can sign some books, people who want to.
If anybody wants to sign
dedicate
on behalf of Matrix.
And maybe just before we go and there is food and drinks prepared by Beatrice, thank you very much. We are looking forward to continue the discussion, but I just want to add to the next talks, because we will have Jane Randall on the 26th of May. May or April? No, April, sorry. 26th of April. Jane Randall, who is also co-founder of Matrix, no? Okay. So
not a co-founder, somebody, what's great about Jane is who's a fantastic feminist around architecture, but she was an apprentice at Matrix in its very last days. So I think she had a pretty difficult time. Okay. So she wasn't involved in but that's fine. She's done amazing things since. Yeah,
she will, unfortunately, she cannot come here for the talk, because she cannot travel, but we decided that we will still make in presence lecture, so we will project her, and so we can also share a moment together, have a drink also, unfortunately not directly with her, but with a video conference. And then we have also the big pleasure to have Dolores Hayden, who will come on the 9th of May. She's in the US, so this will also be on Zoom, and we will also do the same project in the exhibition. And So you're very, I hope you will come again for these 2 talks or follow it by Zoom. Thank you so much.